how do people get inspired? How do individuals, how do churches, how do presbyteries come to embrace and engage this good work?
My involvement with church planting was probably driven by necessity or God's providence in Canada, where I serve. There were just not congregations in Canada. There were some older established congregations, but even now we have 4 congregations in Ontario, 1 in Quebec. And so if I was going to be a pastor in the RP Church in Canada, it necessitated church planting. That was the only option. More and more, we're just dealing with people that have no biblical exposure, biblical literacy. It's really a generation that hasn't even heard the content of the gospel or the scriptures. So, and that's wonderfully exciting to go and hear and speak with people, engage people that have never heard. I was speaking with one fellow at one of the universities in Ottawa, and speaking about Christ, and he said to me, you keep mentioning this resurrection. That seems important to your whole presentation. What is that? He had never heard of the resurrection. I said, well, Jesus was crucified on the cross. Yeah, he said, you know about that? And I said, well, the Bible says that 3 days later he rose from the dead. And he said, wow, that's radical. I said, it sure is. But he had never heard it. He was a master's student in education in a Canadian university and had never heard of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's exciting.
I think people get fired up for church planting by participating in it and by seeing it and being involved. In the St. Lawrence Presbytery, Ed Robeson went over to Rochester when I was in college. Ed Robeson would go over to Rochester every other week for a Bible study with the Mobergs and a couple other folks. And just the idea of doing that was rather revolutionary, at least in my background. I grew up in a small Methodist church, and the idea of planting another church never occurred to us. And being in the RP Church for just a couple of years by that time, that was radical. And then in the presbytery, just the thought of doing that kind of what everybody went, my perception of it was, it was just a new idea. And Rochester struggled for years and years and years, but they were the flagship. And it was, I think it's fair to say, because of Rochester, Ottawa, Oswego, and all the other church plants in St. Louis Presbytery came off of the idea and the struggle and the perseverance in Rochester.
The people that I look up to a little further older than I am, and people who I think 20 years ago had a vision for church planting that our churches are really being blessed by. As I think about those people, I think, were they especially gifted? Well, yeah, they were, but different ones are gifted different ways. What is the characteristic? And that's where I come back to faith. These people had a strong faith in God, that God would bless their labors. And then different ones of them have gone about it different ways, some with 30-fold, some with 50-fold, some with 100-fold or whatever. But that faith is contagious.
I think one element of it that's been alive in the Great Lakes Gulf Presbytery for many years has just been a sense of church planting as an integral part of the life and ministry of the presbytery.
I married into the RP Church kind of kicking and screaming, but once I settled my issues with the denomination and kind of came to love it, realized that the church I had come in, which was the Lafayette congregation in Indiana, and then as I got around to the other congregations in the state, there seemed to be not just a love of church planting, but there seemed to be a real culture of church planting, that it was just always expected. It was just part of who all the churches were. Almost all the churches there had been recently planted, in terms of church history, very recently planted, and there really just seemed to be a culture of church planting. It just seemed to be in the soil and in the air. It's just what we did. We were praying about. Pastor Long was working on various church plants at different points. That was always before the congregation, always something the congregation was excited about. And that just catches on. You just catch it, and you just see it, and you see the value of it and the fruit of it. And it, rather than detracting from the local congregation, to see how a passion for church planting helped the Lafayette Church and made them a stronger church, really brought, I guess, more conviction and love for the whole enterprise to my heart.
In my experience, it's been more of a culture of church planting that seems to have been nurtured over many years in the Midwest Presbytery. And I call it a culture of church planting because it's there hasn't been any one earth-shaking, changing event that has brought about a shift, but more or less a deliberate bringing before the presbytery the work of church planting and of evangelism.
Well, one of the things that I've had a heart for is college students. Jean and I's experience when we were in college was when other families welcomed us into their home when we were in college. And we saw that as a big benefit to our spiritual growth. And so it was just a natural thing to want to be involved with the college students because we had experienced that benefit of being in a Christian home while away at college.
And when we chose our home, there weren't a lot of homes to pick from that in the Manhattan area. But we said we want a home where we can invite college students because we knew Manhattan is a college town, and we wanted a big place for the dining area, the living area, and a yard, a big decent yard, and the Lord provided that for us.
I have to say that I think one of the biggest influences in several of our core families has actually been the RP short-term missions over the last 10 years or so. Our core group is relatively to very young, and I think that the missions mindset has given a really, really good direction to that energy in our church. So that's been a big part of it. We've also had people who are simply very faithful and very concerned for the part of the world where they lived. The David and Darrell Robeson family have lived in Rhode Island for a long time. They're members of the Cambridge Reformed Presbyterian Church for a long time. They desired to see not just an RP work, but to see biblical churches being planted in Rhode Island.
We had a wonderful core group of families. I would say there were 4 families especially that on their own initiative got the idea, had the desire, the Spirit led them to make a proposal to the Home Mission Board on their own. I wasn't part of that at all. We were gone in seminary in the States, and they had put it all together themselves. And so it wasn't me coming to a place and try to get people on board. Here were a people that were already desiring so much to serve Christ, worship Christ, reach their neighbors in a community. And they just said, would you come along and help us?